Before Skyrim held its first mountain, before the land itself had learned the shape of stone, there was nothing that could be called a world. There was only the void, a silence so complete it carried no echo, no warmth, no direction. From that silence, two forces emerged not as beings, but as conditions. Anu and Padme, the principles of stasis and change, of light and shadow, of order and the chaos that order requires to define itself. These two forces did not war immediately. For a time that cannot be measured in years or ages, they simply existed in relation to each other, their interaction producing something neither had intended. That unintended something was near, and from near came creation. From creation came consequence, and from consequence eventually came everything. The world that grew from that original tension was not built in peace. It was contested from its very first moment. Padme, understanding that Nir had chosen Anu over the void, struck at creation in grief and fury. Anu responded by sealing his brother away, wrapping the remnants of their conflict into a new form. The shattered pieces of Nir's creation became the stars. The blood of Padme became the void that still surrounds them. And from this wound, from this first act of violence between opposing principles, the foundation of the Elder Scrolls universe that was laid. If stories like these keep you watching into the early hours, consider subscribing. There is always more to uncover. What followed that primordial fracture was the long, slow work of gods and spirits shaping a cosmos that did not yet know what it wanted to be. The timeline of Skyrim, the province, the culture, the war, the dragon crisis, sits at the far end of a chain of causation that stretches back through thousands of years of divine conflict, mortal struggle, and civilizations rising and dissolving like frost on stone. This script will trace that full chain. It will begin in the earliest mythic ages, move through the founding of the great Elven empires, follow the emergence of humanity, witness the birth and death of gods, the rise and fall of the dragon cult, the fracturing of nations, the long shadow of the Septim bloodline, and finally arrive at the events of the Fourth Era, at a border crossing, a cart, and a war that would pull a sleeping dragon back into the sky. Every cause will be named. Every consequence will be followed. Nothing will be rushed. In the beginning, before mortal feet had pressed into soil, the Aedra and the Daedra emerged from the interplay of Anu and Padme's essences. The Aedra were those spirits who agreed to participate in creation, who gave of themselves to build a world. The Daedras were those who refused, who preserved their full divine essence by standing apart. This distinction mattered enormously because the act of creation costs something. The Aedra, who contributed to the making of Mundus, the mortal plane, gave up portions of their divine power to do so, binding themselves to what they had built in ways the Daedra never experienced. The Daedras remained whole, sovereign, and largely indifferent to the world below, occasionally reaching into it, but never truly part of it. Among the Aedra, one stands at the center of the creation myth, Lorcan, the spirit whose idea the mortal world was in the first place. Lorcan was a trickster figure, a persuader, an entity who convinced the other divine spirits to participate in the creation of Mundus by concealing or misrepresenting what it would cost them. Whether this deception was malicious or visionary depends entirely on who tells the story. The Elves, who remember the gods as their ancestors, consider Lorcan a villain, a betrayer who tricked the divine into diminishment. The humans, who emerged from Mundus and owe their existence to its creation, tend to view Lorcan as a necessary sacrifice, the engine of mortal possibility. Both readings contain truth, both carry grief. The creation of Mundus proceeded through a process the in-world scholars called the Convention, in which the divine spirits shaped the world according to their natures and desires, each contributing something essential. Magnus, the architect of the Aetherius plan, designed the physical laws of the world. When he saw what the mortal plane would cost him, he fled, tearing a hole in the sky as he departed, which became the sun. His followers, the Magna-G, fled after him, and their passage tore smaller holes that became the stars. The world was left incomplete, cooling and solidifying around the contributions of those who had stayed. What remained was Nirn, a world built by sacrifice, shaped by abandonment, and lit by the wounds of those who had escaped it. Lorcan's fate was the most severe. The other Aedra, recognizing what he had done, tore out his divine heart and cast it across Nirn as punishment. His body became the moons, Maser and Secunda, which hang in the sky as permanent reminders of the cost of creation. But Lorcan's heart did not simply vanish. It landed in the volcanic region that would later be called Morrowind, buried deep beneath the earth, still beating, still carrying the remnant power of a god who had been unmade but not destroyed. That buried heart would anchor one of the most consequential storylines in the Elder Scrolls universe, though its full significance would not surface for thousands of years. The world that solidified in the wake of this divine drama was populated first by the Aeonophei, the Earthbones, the ancestral spirits who became the first peoples of Nirn. From these ancestral peoples descended two broad lines: the Mer, who remembered their divine origins most clearly and preserved that memory in culture, architecture, and religion, and the Men, who had drifted further from the divine source and carried that distance as both a wound and a freedom. The Mer built the first great civilizations. The Men built the first great empires. And between them, across thousands of years, the history of Tamriel was written in conquest, collapse, and the occasional moment of genuine peace that never lasted quite long enough. The first great Elven civilization to leave a mark on the history that would eventually produce Skyrim was the Aldmer, the Elder Folk, the original Elves who settled the Somerset Isles and built a culture of such refinement and self-regard that it became the template against which every subsequent Elven civilization measured itself. The Aldmer believed themselves to be the closest living descendants of the divine spirits, and they organized their society accordingly, with those who could most clearly trace their divine lineage at the apex of a rigid hierarchy. This arrangement produced extraordinary art, architecture, and magical knowledge. It also produced a cultural brittleness that would over centuries cause the Aldmer to fracture into distinct subraces as populations migrated, adapted, and developed their own interpretations of what it meant to be descended from gods. The Chimer were among the most significant of these fractures. Led by the prophet Veloth, a group of Aldmer who rejected the ancestor worship model of the Somerset Isles followed a call from the Daedric princes, particularly Boethia, Mephala, and Azura, and migrated east to the land that would become Morrowind. The Chimer, whose name meant the people of the North Star, were golden-skinned and fervent, in their devotion to the Daedra they had chosen over the old Aldmeri pantheon. Their migration was not merely geographical, it was theological, philosophical, and ultimately political, establishing the conditions for one of the most dramatic divine transformations in recorded history. A transformation that would reshape the landscape of Morrowind and the fate of its people for thousands of years to come. While the Chimer settled Morrowind's ash-dusted interior, another group of Aldmeri migrants had arrived there first. The Dwemer, the dwarves of Elder Scrolls lore, though they were not short or subterranean in the traditional fantasy sense, were a deeply rationalist people who had rejected both Aldmeri ancestor worship and Daedric devotion in favor of something far more radical, the systematic investigation of the world's underlying mechanics. The Dwemer built cities underground, not out of necessity, but out of architectural preference, carving enormous caverns and filling them with brass machinery, steam-driven automata, and the products of a scientific tradition that treated the divine not as beings to be worshipped, but as forces to be understood and, if possible, replicated. Their relationship with the Chimer was one of persistent, grinding hostility, a conflict rooted in theological incompatibility as much as territorial competition, and one that would simmer for centuries before arriving at a catastrophe so complete it removed the Dwemer from the world entirely. In the northwest of Tamriel, in the land that would one day be called Skyrim, a different group of early Aldmeri migrants had settled and undergone their own transformation. The Falmer, the Snow Elves, occupied Skyrim's cold expanse and built a civilization of their own, one that history would treat with particular cruelty. The Snow Elves possessed a culture that later sources suggest was sophisticated and genuinely beautiful, though the surviving records are sparse and largely filtered through the perspectives of those who came after. What is documented is what happened to them, the arrival of the Atmorans. The Atmorans were men, the ancestors of the Nords, a people who had crossed the sea from the frozen continent of Atmora to the north and settled in Skyrim's coastal regions. The relationship between the early Atmorans and the Snow Elves was not initially one of pure conflict. Some records suggest periods of coexistence, even cooperation, but the event known as the Night of Tears ended whatever equilibrium had existed. The Snow Elves attacked and destroyed the Atmoran settlement of Sarthal, killing nearly all of its inhabitants. The survivors who escaped carried word back to Atmora, and what returned was not a settlement party. It was an army. Ysgramor, the Atmoran king who led the return to Skyrim, became the founding figure of Nord civilization and one of the most consequential individuals in the entire history of Tamriel. His fleet of 500 warriors, the 500 companions, landed on Skyrim's shore and began what the Nord histories would call the Return, and what the Snow Elves experienced as a systematic extermination. The Falmer were driven from their cities, their strongholds, their forests. Those who survived the initial campaigns fled underground, seeking refuge with the very Dwemer who had long occupied Skyrim's depths. The Dwemer agreed to shelter the Snow Elves, but at a price so devastating it amounted to a second destruction. They fed the refugees a fungus that over generations stripped away the Snow Elves' sight, their intelligence, and eventually their very identity as a people. The creatures that emerged from that darkness, the blind, feral Falmer who persist in Skyrim's ruins in the Fourth Era, are the inheritors of what was once a civilization. That knowledge sits in the background of every encounter with them, quiet and terrible. Ysgramor's conquest of Skyrim established the foundation of Nord culture, and at the center of that culture was something the Nords would call the voice. The Thu'um, the storm voice, the dragon shout, was an understanding of language itself as a fundamental force of reality. In the cosmology of the Elder Scrolls, the world was created through a process called the Elnofexa song, a divine act of naming and speaking that gave form to the formless. The Thu'um was a mortal echo of that creative act. To speak a word of power was to reach into the fabric of reality and compel it to respond. Fire came at the call of the right syllables. Stone moved, time bent, the dead stirred. The Nords did not discover the Thu'um in isolation. They learned it from the dragons. The dragons of Nirn were not simply large predatory creatures. They were, in the theological framework of the Elder Scrolls, fragments of the divine, beings whose very nature was the voice, who existed as expressions of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, the chief of the Aedric pantheon. Dragons did not merely use the Thu'um, they were the Thu'um, their bodies and souls composed of the same fundamental force that the Nords were learning to approximate with mortal throats. The relationship between early men and dragons in Skyrim's ancient history was one of the most defining dynamics of the entire First Era, and it did not remain stable for long. In the earliest period of Atmoran settlement, the dragons and men had coexisted under a system that suited the dragons entirely and served men only in the most limited sense. The dragon cult was the institutional expression of this arrangement, a religious and political hierarchy in which dragon priests governed human communities on behalf of their draconic lords. The dragon priests were enormously powerful individuals, granted long life and magical ability by the dragons they served, and they maintained control through a combination of genuine spiritual authority and the threat of violence that came with having a dragon as one's patron. The common people who lived under dragon priest rule existed in conditions that ranged from demanding to brutal. Their labor, their worship, and their submission all directed upward toward beings who regarded mortal life as a resource rather than a community. The dragon cult spread across ancient Skyrim and built the great stone structures that still dominate the landscape in the Fourth Era: the word walls, the burial mounds, the ancient Nordic ruins that adventurers pick through in search of treasure and find instead the preserved weight of a civilization that organized itself around draconic worship. These structures were not merely temples, they were the physical infrastructure of a theology, built to last because the dragons who commissioned them expected to last forever. They were wrong. The rebellion against the dragon cult is called the Dragon War in Nord histories, and it stands as one of the most significant events in the pre-Imperial history of Skyrim. The precise timeline is difficult to establish with confidence, as the events occurred in the Merethic Era, the mythic age before the standardized calendar, but the broad arc is clear. The common Nords, ground down by generations of servitude, rose against their dragon priest rulers. The rebellion was made possible by a crucial development. Some dragons, recognizing the injustice of their kind's dominion over mortals, chose to side with the humans. These rebel dragons taught the Nords not merely how to use the Thuum, but how to use it against dragons specifically, how to strip a dragon of its power, how to bind it, how to kill it permanently. Among these rebel dragons, three names stand above the others in the surviving records. Paarthurnax, whose name means ambition overlord cruelty in the dragon language, was the most significant, not because he was the most powerful, but because of whose second in command he had been before his rebellion. Paarthurnax had served Alduin, and Alduin was not simply the most powerful dragon in Skyrim. Alduin was the World Eater, the firstborn of Akatosh, the dragon whose purpose in the divine plan was to consume the world at the end of time and thus allow a new age to begin. The nature of Alduin's role, whether he was a destroyer, a recycler, or something more complex, is a question that the in-world scholars debated for centuries. What was not debated was his power. Alduin stood at the apex of draconic existence, and the rebellion against the dragon cult was, at its deepest level, a rebellion against him. The heroes who led the human side of the dragon war were the first dragonborn, mortals who possessed the soul of a dragon within a human body, and who could therefore absorb the power of a slain dragon's soul, accumulating strength in a way no ordinary Nord could match. The ancient tongues, as they were called, used this ability to fight the dragon war to its conclusion, and when the final confrontation with Alduin came, they faced a problem that no conventional weapon could solve. Alduin could not simply be killed. His divine nature made permanent death impossible through ordinary means. Instead, the ancient heroes used an Elder Scroll, one of the mysterious artifacts that existed outside of time, containing knowledge so vast and paradoxical that reading one risked destroying the reader's mind, to cast Alduin forward through time, removing him from the present moment and sending him to an unspecified point in the future. It was not a victory, it was a postponement, and everyone involved understood that the postponement would eventually end. In the quiet aftermath of the Dragon War, Skyrim reorganized itself. The dragon priests were dead or entombed, the surviving dragons scattered and diminished, and the Nord people emerged from centuries of servitude into something that resembled freedom. The High King system developed, a loose confederation of Nordic holds, each governed by a Jarl, with a High King at the apex whose authority was real but not absolute. The Thuum remained central to Nord culture, practiced and preserved by orders of warriors called the Greybeards, who lived in monasteries and treated the voice as a sacred discipline rather than a weapon. The knowledge of the Dragon War was encoded in the great stone word walls that dotted the landscape, preserving the language of the dragons in carved form so that future generations could learn what their ancestors had fought to protect. Skyrim was not isolated from the broader history of Tamriel during these centuries. To the south, the human civilization of Cyrodiil was developing, and the elven empires of the Aldmer and their descendants continued to exert pressure on every human-held territory. The Nords, with their martial culture and their connection to the Thuum, were formidable neighbors, and in the early First Era, they demonstrated exactly how formidable by launching their own expansionist campaigns across Tamriel. At the height of Nordic power, Nord armies controlled territory, stretching from Skyrim south through Cyrodiil and even into parts of the eastern provinces. The first empire of the Nords was not long-lasting by the standards of later empires, but it established the template of Nordic cultural confidence that would persist through every subsequent era. What disrupted the first Nordic Empire was not military defeat by an outside power, but internal fracture, specifically the emergence of a figure named Shor, or rather the conflict over his legacy. The theological and political disputes that followed the Dragon War left scars in Nord culture that never fully healed, and those scars occasionally reopened in ways that cost the Nords their unity at critical moments. The broader collapse of Nordic dominance over Tamriel came gradually, as Cyrodiilic human culture developed its own coherence and the Elven powers regrouped. Far to the south and east, the long simmering conflict between the Chimer and the Dwemer in Morrowind arrived at its catastrophic conclusion. The Battle of Red Mountain, an event so enormous in its consequences that it reshaped not just Morrowind, but the theological landscape of the entire continent, took place at a moment when the two peoples had been fighting for generations. The Nords, allied with the Chimer at various points, had also been drawn into this conflict. What happened at Red Mountain involved the Dwemer attempting to use Lorkhan's heart, the divine artifact buried beneath the volcano since the dawn of creation, to achieve something unprecedented, the creation of a new god, or the transformation of the Dwemer people into something divine. Kagrenak, the Dwemer's chief architect and tonal architect, had constructed 3 tools specifically designed to interface with the heart's power: Sunder, Wraithguard, and Keening. The plan was to use these tools to tap into the heart's divine energy and channel it into the Dwemer people collectively, elevating their entire race. What actually happened is a matter of some scholarly dispute, but the outcome is not. Every Dwemer on Nirn vanished simultaneously, not died, vanished. Their bodies disappeared, leaving behind only their empty cities, their still-running machinery, and a mystery that no subsequent civilization ever fully solved. The most widely accepted interpretation is that Kagrenak's use of the tools went catastrophically wrong, and the Dwemer were somehow transformed, pushed into a state of existence that was neither mortal nor divine, scattered across some plane of reality that could not be accessed or observed. Whether this constituted transcendence or annihilation was never determined. The disappearance of the Dwemer had immediate consequences for the Chimer. With their ancient enemy gone, the Chimer might have celebrated. Instead, they faced the wrath of Azura, one of the 3 Daedric princes to whom they had devoted themselves. The Chimer hero Nerevar, who had led his people through the Battle of Red Mountain, had been killed, the precise circumstances disputed bitterly between different factions, with the 3 individuals who would become the tribunal each claiming a different version of events. What Azura did in response to the breaking of a sacred oath was to curse the Chimer people entirely, changing their golden skin to the ashen gray and their eyes to the burning red that define the Dunmer, the dark elves, to the present day. The Chimer ceased to exist. The Dunmer took their place, carrying the same culture, the same memories, and a new appearance that would mark them forever as a people who had been transformed by divine anger. 3 of the Chimer survivors, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil, had used Kagrenak's tools on the heart to claim divine power for themselves, becoming the tribunal gods of Morrowind. Their ascension was the source of Azura's anger, as it violated the compact that had defined the Chamber's relationship with their Daedric patrons. The tribunal's godhood was real but contingent, dependent on continued access to the heart, and it would sustain Morrowind for thousands of years before its own contradictions caught up with it. That reckoning, too, lay in the future. While Morrowind processed its catastrophe, the rest of Tamriel continued its long, complicated development. The First Era was a period of enormous political turbulence, with various human and elven powers competing for dominance. The Alessian Empire, founded by the former slave Alessia in Cyrodiil after a revolt against the Aeolid elven overlords, represented the first major human empire to achieve genuine continental reach. Alessia herself was a figure of almost mythic significance, said to have been guided by Akatosh himself, to have brokered a covenant between the divine and mortal worlds that established the conditions under which the mortal plane would continue to function. The Alessian order that grew from her legacy became one of the most powerful religious institutions in Tamriel's history, and also one of the most destructive, eventually triggering conflicts that would reshape the continent's political map. The Alessian doctrines, the theological framework developed by the monk Marok, who claimed to receive visions from Alessia after her death, pushed toward an increasingly radical monotheism that stripped the pantheon of its complexity and demanded the suppression of elven religious traditions throughout the empire. The conflict this produced was not merely religious, it was civilizational. The Durrani hegemony, an elven power based in High Rock, became the primary military opposition to Alessian expansion, and the Battle of Glenumbra Moors in the First Era, year 328, resulted in a decisive defeat for the Alessian forces that halted their westward expansion. The Alessian order survived this defeat, but was weakened, and the fractures it created in the empire's internal coherence would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Alessian Empire itself. The Second Era began with a vacuum. The Alessian Empire had fallen, and the various peoples of Tamriel spent the early centuries of this new age reorganizing, fighting, and occasionally building something that might last before it, too, collapsed. The period known as the interregnum, the 329 years between the fall of the Raymond dynasty and the founding of the Third Empire, was one of the most chaotic in Tamriel's recorded history. No single power controlled Cyrodiil. The Ruby Throne sat empty or was occupied by a rapid succession of pretenders. The provinces pursued their own agendas with the freedom that comes from having no effective imperial authority to answer to. Skyrim during the early Second Era was a land of competing jarls and shifting alliances, its High King system functioning as intended, which is to say, contentiously. The Nords maintained their cultural identity with fierce consistency, their relationship to the Thu'um and to the memory of the Dragon War forming the bedrock of a national character that resisted outside influence with the same stubbornness their ancestors had shown against the dragon priests. The Greybeards continued their practice in the monastery of High Hrothgar, perched on the throat of the world, Skyrim's highest peak, the mountain the Nords called the home of the sky itself. Their tradition held that the voice was too powerful, too sacred, and too dangerous to be used as a weapon in ordinary political conflicts. This position put them in perpetual tension with the more martial uses of the Thu'um that Nord warriors continued to practice. Among the most significant events of the Second Era for Skyrim's long-term history was the founding of the Companions, the warrior guild that traced its lineage directly back to Ysgramor's 500 and maintained its headquarters in Whiterun's Jorrvaskr, a mead hall said to have been built around an overturned ship brought from Atmora. The Companions' history during the Second Era included a transformation that would shadow the organization for centuries. The acquisition of lycanthropy through a pact with the Daedric prince Hircine. The Companions' inner circle, the Circle, became werewolves, gaining power and ferocity at the cost of a soul promised to Hircine's hunting grounds after death. This arrangement was kept secret from most of the organization's members, a hidden weight carried by those at the center of one of Skyrim's most respected institutions. The event that would ultimately reshape all of Tamriel, including Skyrim, was set in motion in the Second Era by a Dunmer sorcerer king named Zurin Arctus, and more significantly, by the man who would become Tiber Septim. Tiber Septim, also known as Talos, also known by the name Hjalti Earlybeard among the Nords who remembered his origins, was a general from Atmora who rose through the military ranks of a fragmented Tamriel to accomplish something no one had managed since the Alessian Empire, the conquest and unification of the entire continent under a single banner. The campaigns of Tiber Septim are among the most documented and most disputed events in Elder Scrolls history, with different provinces remembering his conquest in ways that reflect their own relationship to what he built. In Skyrim, Tiber Septim was claimed as a Nord, a son of the province, a warrior who had learned the Thu'um and carried its power into his campaigns. The Nords' pride in this claim was enormous, and it formed the foundation of their particular attachment to the empire he founded. Tiber Septim used the Thu'um in battle. Accounts describe the Shout Rodah, an unrelenting force used to devastating effect, and his connection to the voice gave his conquest a quality that felt to the Nords like a fulfillment of their own cultural destiny. A Nord, or a man who could be claimed as a Nord, had united the world. The tools Tiber Septim used to complete his conquest included something more than martial skill. The Numidium, a brass golem of Dwemery construction, enormous in scale and powered by a divine artifact, was deployed in the final campaigns of unification with effects so disruptive to the fabric of reality that the event became known as the Warp in the West. The Numidium's power derived from the Mantella, a soul gem containing the heart of Zurin Arctus, and its use bent the rules of causality in ways that historians are still attempting to reconcile. What matters for the Skyrim timeline is that Tiber Septim completed his conquest, founded the Third Empire, and then did something unprecedented. He became a god. The apotheosis of Tiber Septim, his ascension to divinity as Talos, the ninth divine of the Imperial pantheon, is one of the most contested theological events in Elder Scrolls lore. The Altmer of the Aldmeri Dominion refused to accept it, arguing that a man cannot become a god, that the divines are fixed and ancient, and Talos is an impostor whose worship is a political fiction designed to legitimize imperial conquest. The Nords accept it absolutely, with a ferocity that borders on the personal, because Talos is their god, a Nord made divine, a validation of their people's place in the cosmic order. This theological dispute would not remain abstract. It would eventually become the central fault line of a war. The Third Empire that Tiber Septim founded lasted through the Second Era's final years and into the Third Era, which the Imperial calendar reckoned from his coronation. The Septim dynasty governed Tamriel through a succession of emperors, each carrying the dragon blood that Akatosh had granted to Alesia and her descendants, a divine mandate that bound the empire's legitimacy to a bloodline, and that bloodline to the power of the dragon god of time. The Septim emperors were not uniformly capable or admirable, but the institution they represented held Tamriel together in ways that prevented the chaos of the interregnum from returning. The system worked imperfectly and often violently for several hundred years. The greatest crisis of the Third Era arrived not from outside the empire, but from within it. Uriel Septim VII, who would rule for 65 years and become one of the most significant emperors in the dynasty's history, faced a threat that began with his own court. The assassination conspiracy orchestrated by the mythic Dawn, a Daedric cult devoted to Mehrunes Dagon, the Prince of Destruction. The mythic Dawn's plan, executed over years of patient infiltration, was to open the gates of Oblivion, to tear holes in the barrier between Nirn and the plain of Mehrunes Dagon, and allow the forces of Cold Harbor and destruction to flood into the mortal world. The mechanism for this plan was the destruction of the dragonfires in the Imperial city, which required the elimination of the Septim bloodline and the theft of the Amulet of Kings. The Oblivion Crisis, the events of the Elder Scrolls. 4. Oblivion began with Uriel Septim VII's assassination. His 3 sons had already been killed before him. The last surviving heir was Martin Septim, an illegitimate son who had become a priest of Akatosh in the city of Kvatch, unaware of his own lineage. The protagonist of Oblivion, the hero of Kvatch, discovered Martin, protected him, and ultimately assisted in the only solution available when Mehrunes Dagon himself stepped through into Nirn. Martin Septim shattered the Amulet of Kings and transformed himself into the avatar of Akatosh, a divine dragon of fire and time that engaged Mehrunes Dagon directly and drove him back into Oblivion, sealing the barrier permanently. Martin Septim did not survive this act. The avatar of Akatosh became a stone statue in the Temple of the One, and the Septim bloodline ended. The dragonfires, no longer maintained by a dragonblood emperor, went cold permanently. The empire continued under the Mid Dynasty that eventually emerged from the political chaos that followed, but the divine mandate was gone. The empire that persisted into the Fourth Era was a secular institution, its legitimacy resting on military power and administrative tradition rather than the covenant between Akatosh and Alesia that had sustained it for centuries. This loss of divine backing was not immediately catastrophic, but it created a vulnerability that the world's other powers would eventually exploit. In the quiet that followed the Oblivion Crisis, Tamriel processed an enormous loss. Hundreds of thousands had died. Entire cities had been burned or taken by Oblivion gates. The landscape of Cyrodiil bore the scars of the conflict in ruins and depopulated regions that would take generations to recover. The Empire, deprived of its dragon blood heir, entered a period of political instability as various factions competed to fill the power vacuum. The Mede dynasty eventually consolidated control, but they did so without the theological authority that had made the Septim name synonymous with imperial legitimacy. Morrowind, already struggling with the consequences of the events of the Elder Scrolls III, Morrowind, in which the tribunal's divine power had collapsed, Dagoth-Ur had been defeated, and the heart of Lorkhan had been destroyed, faced a catastrophe of its own in the years following the Oblivion crisis. The Red Year, occurring in the Fourth Era Year 5, saw the eruption of the Red Mountain in an explosion of such violence that it reshaped the geography of Morrowind and killed a significant portion of the Dunmer population. The eruption was followed almost immediately by an invasion of the Argonian people from Black Marsh, a retribution for centuries of Dunmer slave-keeping that the Argonians, emboldened by the Empire's weakness and Morrowind's devastation, prosecuted with systematic efficiency. The Dunmer who survived became refugees, many of them settling in Skyrim's eastern city of Windhelm, where they would find a welcome that was at best grudging. Skyrim in the Fourth Era was a province in tension. The civil resentments that had accumulated over centuries of imperial rule, the sense among many Nords that their culture, their language, their traditions, and their gods were being diluted or suppressed by imperial influence, had never fully dissipated. The Nords had always been proud, and pride in a culture that had produced the Thu'um, that had fought the Dragon War, that had given the world its greatest emperor in Tiber Septim, was not the kind of pride that submitted easily to outside governance. The Empire, for its part, needed Skyrim, the province's resources, its strategic position, and its warriors were essential to maintaining whatever remained of imperial power in the Fourth Era. The event that brought this tension to a breaking point was the Great War. In the Fourth Era, year 171, the Aldmeri Dominion, the reformed Elven Empire of the Altmer, the Bosmer, and the Khajiit, led by the Thalmor, declared war on the Empire. The Thalmor were the ruling political and religious body of the Dominion, and their ideology was rooted in a specific theological position: that the creation of the mortal world was a mistake, that the Aedra who participated in it were diminished by the act, and that the correct goal of Elven civilization was to reverse the process, to unravel Mundus and return all things to the divine state that preceded creation. This ideology, called the Thalmor's long game by those who understood it, required first the destruction of Talos worship, because Talos, a man who had become a god, represented the ultimate validation of the mortal world's legitimacy. If a mortal could ascend to divinity, then mortality was not a diminishment to be escaped, but a path to be walked. The Thalmor could not accept this. The Great War lasted 4 years and reached its nadir when Aldmeri forces captured the imperial city itself. The Emperor Titus Mede II, forced to abandon his capital, regrouped his forces and launched a counterattack that eventually drove the Dominion out of Cyrodiil, but the cost was enormous, and the Empire was exhausted. The peace that followed, the White Gold Concordat, signed in the Fourth Era year 175, was a settlement that gave the Thalmor most of what they wanted diplomatically, including the official ban on Talos worship throughout Imperial territory. The Empire's negotiators understood what they were signing. The Nords understood it too when word reached Skyrim, and their response was the slow, grinding accumulation of fury that would eventually produce the Stormcloak Rebellion. In Skyrim, the ban on Talos worship was not merely a religious imposition, it was an identity assault. Talos was a Nord, or could be claimed as one, and his worship was embedded in Nord culture in ways that the Thalmor, operating from a position of genuine theological conviction, either did not understand or did not care about. The Thalmor justiciars who moved through Skyrim enforcing the ban were not merely suppressing a religious practice, they were dismantling a cultural anchor, and they were doing so with the tacit permission of an empire that the Nords had once considered their own. The resentment this produced was enormous and entirely predictable. Ulfric Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm, became the focal point of Nord resistance. His background was complicated in ways that his supporters preferred not to examine too closely. He had been captured by the Thalmor during the Great War, and according to Thalmor records recovered later, had provided information to them during his captivity, whether willingly or under duress. The Thalmor's relationship with Ulfric was one of careful cultivation. They considered him a useful asset because his rebellion kept Skyrim destabilized and the Empire weakened, serving Aldmeri interests without the Dominion having to spend its own resources. Whether Ulfric knew this, whether he was a genuine nationalist used as a tool or something more compromised, was a question that the Civil War did not resolve. What Ulfric did that made resolution impossible was kill the High King. Torrig, the young High King of Skyrim, was challenged by Ulfric in solitude and killed using the Thuum, specifically the shout Roda, the same unrelenting force that Tiber Septim himself had used in conquest. The symbolism was deliberate. The killing itself was, by the standards of ancient Nord tradition, arguably legal. A high king could be challenged and defeated in single combat. But the manner of the killing, using the voice against a man who could not respond in kind, struck many as an execution dressed up as a duel. The Empire arrested Ulfric and transported him toward what was intended to be a trial in solitude. The transport was ambushed by Imperial forces, catching a different group of Stormcloak soldiers, and Ulfric ended up in a cart heading for Helgen, along with a horse thief, several Stormcloak soldiers, and a figure whose identity would prove to be the most consequential thing that happened in Skyrim in 4,000 years. The prisoner who arrived at Helgen without a name on the execution list was the last Dragonborn. The nature of the Dragonborn, a mortal with the soul of a dragon, capable of absorbing the power of slain dragons, and using the Thuum with a facility that took ordinary Nords decades to develop, had not appeared in the world since the time of Tiber Septim, and before him only rarely. The divine gift of dragon blood, granted by Akatosh, was not something that could be manufactured or inherited in any predictable way. It appeared when it was needed, and it was needed now because something was happening in Skyrim that no one yet fully understood. Alduin was returning. The World Eater, cast forward through time by the ancient heroes using an Elder Scroll, had arrived in the Fourth Era. His return began not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet, terrible act at a burial mound called Helgen, or rather, at Helgen itself, where his appearance interrupted an execution and changed the course of everything that followed. The last Dragonborn survived Helgen because Alduin attacked it. The dragon's fire destroyed the Imperial execution site, killed soldiers on both sides of the Civil War, and scattered the survivors into a landscape that was suddenly, undeniably, host to dragons again. The return of the dragons was not random. Alduin had been moving through Skyrim before Helgen, visiting the ancient burial mounds where the dragon priests and their draconic lords had been entombed, using his power to resurrect them. The burial mounds cracked open. Dragons that had slept for thousands of years emerged into a world that had forgotten what they were. The first encounters were catastrophic for the communities unlucky enough to be nearby. The town of Helgen was only the most dramatic early casualty. Farms burned, travelers disappeared. The Jarl's guards, trained to fight human opponents, found that their swords and bows made no impression on creatures whose scales were hardened by the same divine essence that composed the voice itself. The last Dragonborn's identity was not immediately understood, even by the Dragonborn themselves. The first dragon killed in the Fourth Era's resurgence, a creature named Mirmulnir, who attacked the western watchtower near Whiterun, died at the hands of a combined force of Whiterun guards and the Dragonborn. What happened afterward revealed everything. The dragon's body burned away, and its soul, the concentrated essence of a divine being, flowed into the Dragonborn and was absorbed. The guards who witnessed it recognized the phenomenon from their histories. They called the ancient word Dovahkiin, Dragonborn. The graybeards of High Hrothgar, who had maintained their silent vigil on the throat of the world for centuries, heard the shout that the Dragonborn sent into the sky and responded with a summons that shook the stones of every city in Skyrim. The call of the graybeards was a sound that had not been heard in living memory, and its meaning was unmistakable to anyone who knew Nord history. Someone had been recognized. Someone had been called. The Dragonborn ascended the 7,000 steps to High Hrothgar, passing through the thinning air and the cold that settled into the marrow, and met Arngir, the eldest of the four graybeards, who still maintained speech, the others having grown so powerful in the voice that a whispered word could crack stone. Arngir and his brothers trained the Dragonborn in the fundamentals of the Thu'um, teaching the words of power that would be needed in the confrontation they all understood was coming. Paarthurnax, the ancient dragon who had rebelled against Alduin in the First Era and now lived at the very peak of the throat of the world, provided context that the graybeards could not. He had known Alduin personally, had served him before his rebellion, and understood the World Eater's nature in a way no mortal could. The Dragonborn's path, Paarthurnax explained, would require the same Elder Scroll that had been used to banish Alduin the first times, not to banish him again, but to learn the shout that the ancient heroes had used against him, a shout called Dragonrend that was so alien to a dragon's nature that it could not be learned from a word wall or taught by a living master. It had to be witnessed at the moment of its creation. The Elder Scroll itself was not simply located in a library. It had passed through the hands of the Dwemer, who had studied it in Blackreach, the vast underground cavern system beneath Skyrim, before their disappearance. It had been moved, studied, partially understood, and ultimately stored in a place called the Tower of Mazark, deep in the Dwemer ruins beneath the earth. The Dragonborn's journey to recover it passed through Blackreach, an underground world of luminescent plants, and Falmer and the still-functioning Dwemer machinery that had kept running for 4,000 years in the absence of its creators. The hum of brass gears and steam pressure filling caverns that no sunlight had ever touched. With the Elder Scroll recovered, the Dragonborn returned to the throat of the world and read it at the time wound. The scar, in reality, left by the original casting of Alduin forward through time, still present and still accessible to someone with the right kind of sight. Reading an Elder Scroll was not a passive act of perception. It was a confrontation with knowledge that existed outside of time, and the experience of reading one could leave a reader permanently blinded or fractured. The Dragonborn witnessed the moment of Dragonren's creation, absorbed the shout, and returned to the present, where Alduin was waiting. The first confrontation between the last Dragonborn and Alduin took place on the throat of the world, in the shadow of the peak that the Nords had always called the home of the sky. Dragonrend worked. The shout forced Alduin to experience mortality, to feel for the first time what it was to be finite, and the sensation was so disorienting to a being whose nature was the opposite of finitude that it grounded him, made him vulnerable. The battle was fierce, and the outcome was not a clean victory. Alduin was wounded and driven off. He fled to Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife, the realm of Shore, where the honored dead feasted in the Hall of Valor, and began consuming the souls of the dead, feeding on the accumulated power of Nord warriors who had died in battle for thousands of years. The path to Sovngarde required the Dragonborn to learn its location from a living dragon, which meant capturing one. The dragon Oblivion, one of Alduin's lieutenants, was lured to Whiterun and trapped using a device called Dragon's Reach, the Jarl's palace, whose name suddenly made sense because it had been built specifically for this purpose in the ancient past, its great hall designed to hold a dragon. Oblivion, bound and unable to escape, agreed to carry the Dragonborn to the portal to Sovngarde in exchange for his freedom. The portal was located at Skuldhafen, an ancient dragon priest temple in the mountains of eastern Skyrim, guarded by Draugr and the dragon priest Nakreen, whose mask was the key to the portal itself. Sovngarde was a realm of golden light and roiling mist, the mist itself being the substance of the souls Alduin was consuming. A fog of the dead, the accumulated essence of Nord warriors being slowly devoured by the World Eater. The honored dead who had not yet been consumed moved through this mist toward the Hall of Valor, where Shor sat in his great hall and the heroes of Nord history feasted. Among those who had not been consumed were three ancient heroes, Gormleth Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old, the same three tongues who had originally used the Elder Scroll to banish Alduin in the Merethic Era. They had been waiting in Sovngarde for precisely this moment, knowing that the banishment was temporary, and that when Alduin returned, the final confrontation would require their participation. The four of them, three ancient heroes and the last Dragonborn, faced Alduin together in Sovngarde's open sky. The World Eater was in his own realm now, stronger for the souls he had consumed, surrounded by the power of a divine afterlife that amplified rather than diminished him. The battle that followed was the culmination of a cycle that had begun in the Dragon War, the mortal world's final answer to the question of whether Alduin could be stopped. Dragonren stripped him of his certainty, grounded him in the vulnerability he had never been meant to feel, and the combined might of four Dragonblood warriors 3 dead, 1 still living, drove the World Eater to his end. Alduin's soul dispersed into Sovngarde's sky. The mist began to clear. The souls he had consumed were released. Alduin was dead. Not banished, not postponed. Dead. Whether the World Eater's death meant the world would never end, or whether Akatosh would simply produce another instrument of ending when the time came, was a question the living could not answer. What was certain was that the immediate crisis was resolved. The dragons of Skyrim, without Alduin's command and his resurrecting presence, faced a choice: submit to the Dragonborn, whose power and nature they could not deny, or flee. Many submitted. Odaviing himself became something of an ally. Paarthurnax remained on the throat of the world, his rebellion of 4,000 years finally, quietly vindicated. The civil war that had been burning through Skyrim while the dragon crisis unfolded did not simply pause for the apocalyptic events on the throat of the world. In holds across the province, Imperial soldiers and Stormcloak warriors continued to fight and die for their respective visions of Skyrim's future. The conflict had no clean resolution in the canonical sense. The game's design allowed the player to choose a side, meaning that the official lore does not declare a victor. What can be said is that both outcomes were possible and that both carried costs. An Imperial victory meant Ulfric Stormcloak's defeat and death, the restoration of Imperial authority over Skyrim, and the continuation of the White Gold Concordate's ban on Talos worship, a peace purchased at the cost of the Nords' most sacred identity. The Empire's reasoning was pragmatic. A unified Tamriel, even one that had swallowed a humiliating treaty, was better positioned to eventually resist the Aldmeri Dominion than a Skyrim torn apart by civil war. General Tullius and Legate Rika, who led the Imperial forces in Skyrim, genuinely believed this. Their belief was not without foundation. A Stormcloak victory meant Ulfric's ascension as High King, Skyrim's secession from the Empire, and the restoration of open Talos worship, a declaration of cultural identity purchased at the cost of the province's strategic position and the Empire's ability to resist the Dominion collectively. Ulfric's vision of Skyrim was one of Nord cultural supremacy, and while his motivations included genuine patriotism, they also included the exclusions that tend to accompany nationalism. The Dunmer refugees in Windhelm lived in conditions of deliberate neglect under his governance, and the non-Nord peoples of Skyrim had little reason to welcome his vision of what the province should be. Neither outcome was clean, neither was fully right. The Civil War, like most civil wars, was a tragedy of legitimate grievances and illegitimate methods, of people who were not entirely wrong fighting for things that were not entirely good, in a conflict that served the interests of a third party, the Thalmor, more than it served either side. The companions of Whiterun during the same period faced their own internal crisis. The Circle's lycanthropy, the werewolf curse carried by the companions' inner leadership, had been a secret for generations, but it had also become a weight. The Daedric prince Hircine held claim to the souls of every werewolf in his hunting grounds, meaning that companions who died as werewolves could not reach Sovngarde. For warriors whose entire culture was organized around the hope of dying well and feasting with Shor in the afterlife, this was a profound loss. The quest to break the curse, or to honor it, or to find a path through it, occupied the companions during the events of Skyrim's main timeline, a smaller story nested within the larger one, but no less meaningful to those living it. The College of Winterhold, Skyrim's institution of magical learning perched on the cliffs above the Sea of Ghosts in the province's frozen northeast, experienced its own crisis during this period. The college had been a source of tension with Winterhold's residents since the Great Collapse, an event in the Fourth Era year 122, in which most of Winterhold fell into the sea, leaving only the college standing. The residents of the diminished city that remained blamed the mages, a suspicion that the mages denied but could not definitively disprove. The college's internal crisis involved the Eye of Magnus, an ancient artifact of enormous power discovered beneath Sarthal, the very settlement that the Snow Elves had destroyed in the Merethic Era, whose excavation by college students unearthed something that should perhaps have remained buried. The Eye of Magnus was connected to Magnus himself, the architect of Mundus, who had fled before the world's creation was complete, tearing the sun into existence as he departed. The artifact contained a concentration of magical power so vast that it threatened to unmake the fabric of reality in the region around it, and its discovery attracted the attention of the Sigic Order, the ancient magical society that predated the college by thousands of years and operated on a temporal plane, slightly removed from the present. The crisis was resolved through the Staff of Magnus, recovered from the dragon priest Morike in the ruins of Labyrinthian, and the defeat of Ancano, a Thalmor observer embedded in the college who had attempted to use the eye for his own purposes. The Thalmor's interest in the eye was consistent with their broader theological agenda. An artifact of Magnus's power, properly understood and wielded, might serve the goal of unmaking the mortal world that their ideology demanded. The Thieves' Guild of Riften, operating in Skyrim's southeastern hold of the Rift, had fallen on hard times. The guild's decline was not natural. It had been engineered by a member named Mercer Frey, the guild's guildmaster, who had stolen from the guild's vault and sabotaged its operations over years of careful betrayal. Mercer's treachery was enabled by his theft of the Skeleton Key, an artifact of the Daedric Prince Nocturnal that served as the physical anchor of the Twilight Sepulchre, the shrine where the Nightingales, a secret order of thieves who served Nocturnal, maintained their covenant with the Prince of Shadow. The Skeleton Key's removal had weakened the Sepulchre, and by extension, the luck and operational effectiveness of the entire guild. The Dragonborn's involvement in recovering the key and restoring the Sepulchre was the mechanism by which the guild's decline was reversed, and Mercer Frey's long betrayal was ended. The Dark Brotherhood, the ancient assassination guild that served the Daedric Prince Sithis and the Night Mother, Sithis' consort, a figure whose origins were as dark as the void her husband represented, operated from a sanctuary hidden in the pine forest of Falkreath Hold. The Brotherhood had been weakening for years, its membership dwindling, its operations disrupted by the Penitus Oculatus, the Emperor's personal guard, who had made the elimination of the Dark Brotherhood a priority. The crisis that defined the Brotherhood's Fourth Era storyline involved the assassination of Emperor Titus Mede II himself, a contract that the Night Mother placed through the Black Sacrament, performed by a young orphan in Windhelm, a contract that led the Dragonborn through a sequence of events culminating in the Emperor's death on his personal vessel in Skyrim's waters. The assassination did not resolve the Empire's political situation. It deepened it, removing a leader who was flawed but experienced at a moment when the Empire could least afford instability. The Dawn Guard saw a reformed order of vampire hunters operating from Fort Dawnguard in the Rift became relevant during this period because of the ambitions of a vampire lord named Harkon, patriarch of the Volkihar clan, who sought to fulfill an ancient prophecy that would blot out the sun permanently. The tyranny of the sun, as the prophecy was called, would have created a world in which vampires could operate without limitation, and the living would exist only as prey. Harkon's plan required the Bow of Oriel, a divine artifact of the Elven god Ariel, the Altmeri name for Akatosh, and a specific type of blood to corrupt it. The Dragonborn's involvement, whether joining the Dawn Guard or the Volkihar, ultimately led to Harkon's defeat and the preservation of the sun, a resolution that, given everything else threatening Skyrim during this period, felt almost modest in scale but was, for the living people of the province, as essential as any other victory. The final major threat of this period came from a source older than any of the others, Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince of knowledge and fate, and his connection to the island of Solstheim and the dragon priest Miraak. Solstheim, located northeast of Skyrim in the Sea of Ghosts, had been given to the Dunmer as a refuge after the Red Year and was administered by the East Empire Company. Its history included a period in the late Second Era when it had been threatened by the werewolf Hircine's hunt, a crisis resolved by the Nerevarine, the hero of Morrowind's own storyline, whose fate after that resolution was uncertain. The island's deeper history, however, stretched back to the dragon cult, because Miraak had been the very first Dragonborn, a dragon priest who had turned against the dragons before the Dragon War, made a pact with Hermaeus Mora, and been drawn into the prince's realm of Apocrypha, where he had existed for thousands of years, in a state of preserved, frustrated ambition. Miraak's return, his attempt to reach back into Nirn from Apocrypha using the black books that served as portals to Hermaeus Mora's realm, represented a specific threat to the last Dragonborn, the first Dragonborn attempting to absorb the power of the last. The conflict between them was not merely personal, it was theological and cosmological, a question of which Dragonborn held the mandate of Akatosh and what that mandate actually meant. The resolution came in Apocrypha itself, in Hermaeus Mora's realm of infinite knowledge, where the Prince of Fate, characteristically indifferent to the outcome, interested only in the knowledge the conflict would generate, allowed the confrontation to proceed. Miraak fell. The last Dragonborn absorbed his accumulated power and returned to Nirn, carrying the weight of every dragon soul Miraak had hoarded across 4,000 years. In the quiet aftermath of all these events, the defeat of Alduin, the resolution of the Civil War, the clearing of the college's crisis, the restoration of the Thieves' Guild, the defeat of Miraak, Skyrim settled into something that resembled peace. The dragons who remained were fewer and more cautious. The Civil War's wounds were real but survivable. The Thalmor threat had not been resolved. The White Gold Concordat still stood, the Aldmeri Dominion still watched from the south, and the Thalmor Justiciars still moved through the province. but the immediate crises that had threatened to unmake the world had been addressed. The province breathed. What Skyrim's peace could not undo was the accumulated weight of everything that had produced it. The Dunmer in Windhelm's Grey Quarter still lived in conditions of neglect. The Argonians at the docks still faced discrimination from a city whose Jarl had made his contempt for non-Nords a matter of policy. The Forsworn, the Reachmen, the ancient people of the Reach, whose homeland had been conquered by the Nords, and then reconquered, and then lost again in a cycle of violence stretching back centuries, still maintained their camps in the rocky highlands of western Skyrim, their claim to the Reach unresolved and their fury undiminished. The Falmer still moved through the underground darkness, blind and feral, the remnants of a civilization that had been destroyed twice and remembered nothing of what it had once been. The world that the events of Skyrim's Fourth Era produced was not a resolved world. It was a world that had survived its most immediate catastrophes and was now left to live with what those catastrophes had revealed about its deeper contradictions. The Empire's legitimacy remained contested. The Thalmor's ambitions remained active. The question of what the Empire could offer Skyrim and what Skyrim owed the Empire remained unanswered in any way that satisfied both parties. The theological dispute over Talos remained the open wound around which the larger conflict between human and elven civilizations continued to organize itself. The last great unresolved question, the one that scholars in-world and observers outside it continued to circle, was the nature of the Dragonborn's role in what came next. The last Dragonborn had defeated Alduin, absorbed more dragon souls than any previous Dragonborn in recorded history, and navigated a landscape of overlapping crises with a competence that the world's circumstances had demanded. But the Thu'um is not simply a weapon. In the cosmology of the Elder Scrolls, the voice is a creative force, a piece of the mechanism by which reality maintains itself. The Dragonborn who carries that force is not simply a warrior. The role has a weight that extends beyond individual battles, and what that weight ultimately requires of its bearer is a question the surviving records do not answer. Paarthurnax remained on the throat of the world. The Greybeards continued their vigil in High Hrothgar, the mountain's stone vibrating faintly with the accumulated resonance of centuries of practiced voices. The word walls still stood across Skyrim's landscape, carved with the language of the dragons, a language that was also the language of creation, the language in which the world had been spoken into existence. The ancient Nordic burial mounds, emptied now of the dragons that Alduin had raised, stood open and silent, their long occupants finally permanently gone. Skyrim endured. It had always endured. The province had survived the Dragon War, the First Nordic Empire's collapse, the Second Era's chaos, the Oblivion Crisis, the Great War, the Civil War, and the return of the World Eater. Its mountains had stood through all of it, the throat of the world unchanged at the center, the cold that settled into stone and bone, and the silence between gusts of wind carrying the faint memory of a language older than any living tongue. The people who lived beneath those mountains carried their history and their culture, their religion, their architecture, and their arguments, the way all peoples carry history, imperfectly, selectively, with more pride than accuracy, and more grief than they typically acknowledged. What approached on the far horizon of the Fourth Era was not yet fully visible. The Aldmeri Dominion had not abandoned its ambitions. The White Gold Concordat was a pause, not a peace. The theological war over Talos would not remain cold indefinitely. The Empire, weakened and delegitimized, would eventually face a second Great War, a conflict for which the events of Skyrim's Civil War had left it either better or worse prepared, depending on how that war had resolved. The question of whether a unified Tamriel under Imperial governance was preferable to a fragmented one under no governance at all was not a question the Fourth Era had answered. It had only deferred it. And somewhere in the layers of this world, in the Dwemer ruins that still hummed with machinery no living person fully understood, in the Falmer warrens, where something that had once been a civilization moved through darkness, in the ash-drifted ruins of Morrowind, in the Thalmor towers of Alinor, where scholars worked patiently toward an ending they believed was just, the older questions persisted. What was the mortal world for? What did it mean that it had been built by sacrifice and sustained by covenant and defended by mortals who could sometimes carry the souls of gods? What came after the World Eater, if the World Eater was gone? Skyrim did not answer these questions. It only asked them in a new register with the particular urgency of a province that had survived everything and was now, in the cold and the quiet that followed great upheaval, learning what survival actually cost. The mountains held their silence. The wind moved through the pines of Falkreath and the tundra of Whiterun and the ice fields of Winterhold. The stars, those ancient wounds in the sky where the Magna G had fled, continued their slow circuit overhead. And somewhere on the throat of the world, the oldest dragon alive sat in the cold and breathed and waited and remembered everything that had happened and everything that might yet come. The story of Skyrim is not a story that ends. It is a story that settles, briefly, into a shape that can be described, and then continues, in the silence between the telling and the next beginning, into whatever the world decides to become. Before Tamriel held its first breath of wind, before the mountains of Skyrim rose from the primordial dark, there was nothing that could be called silence, because silence requires something against which to measure itself. There was only the void, formless, boundless, without temperature or texture or the faintest suggestion of direction. The void did not wait, because waiting implies the passage of time, and time had not yet been invented. What existed instead was a condition so total and so absolute that even the gods who would later emerge from it struggled to describe what it had felt like to be inside it. From that void, something stirred, not a god yet, not a force with a name, something closer to a dream dreaming itself into awareness, a vibration so fundamental that it preceded sound, preceded light, preceded the very concept of a thing having edges. That vibration would eventually be called the Godhead, and from its dreaming, the universe of Arbus unfolded. Anu and Padme emerged from that dreaming, one representing stasis and light, the other representing change and shadow, and in the space between their eternal opposition, the Aedra were born. These were the spirits who would become gods, mortals, and everything in between. From this foundation, the story of Skyrim began, a vast and layered history stretching from the birth of existence itself to the frost-bitten mysteries still breathing beneath the surface of the coldest province in Tamriel. This is a journey that does not move in a straight line. Skyrim's history accumulates the way ice accumulates on stone, slowly, invisibly, and with tremendous weight. The timeline ahead covers the earliest cosmological events that shaped the land itself, moves through the forgotten civilizations that carved their names into mountains and buried their secrets in unmarked vaults, follows the wars and betrayals and quiet disappearances that no history book fully explains, and arrives at last at the mysteries that still linger in the corners of the game's world, the unanswered questions, the unresolved threads, the silences that suggest something enormous just beneath the surface. If stories told in the deep hours of the night are what keep you watching, consider subscribing. This channel exists to follow those stories wherever they lead, and there is always more waiting to be uncovered. The earliest age of Arbus did not resemble anything a mortal mind could hold comfortably. The spirits who inhabited that primordial era experienced existence in a way that had no fixed form, no stable identity, and no clear boundary between self and world. These Aedra moved through the pre-creation like currents in a sea that had not yet decided to be water. Among them, two forces of particular consequence began to take shape. Anu, drawn toward stillness and the preservation of existing states, generated from within himself a soul, a reflection of his own nature that would eventually crystallize into Anwi-El, the soul of all things. Padme, drawn toward motion and transformation, generated his own reflection, which would become Sithis, the embodiment of change so radical it bordered on destruction. Between these two principles, the Aurbis, the great wheel of existence, found its shape. The Aedra and the Daedra emerged from this primordial negotiation between stasis and change. The Aedra were those at Ada who agreed, under the guidance of the god Lorcan, to sacrifice portions of their divine essence to create the mortal plane, a project so costly that some of them diminished almost entirely in the process. The Daedra, by contrast, refused that sacrifice. They retained their full divine nature and continued to exist as sovereign powers in the outer realms, each governing a plane shaped entirely by their own will and personality. The mortal plane that resulted from the Aedric sacrifice was Nirn, the world, and it bore from its first moment the marks of the cost paid to make it. Lorcan himself was a figure of tremendous ambiguity. The creation myths recorded by different cultures of Tamriel describe him differently, as a trickster, as a martyr, as a villain, as a necessary catastrophe. What most accounts agree upon is that Lorcan convinced or compelled the Aedra to participate in the creation of Nirn, and that when the other gods realized the full cost of what they had done, their response was severe. Magnus, the god of magic, fled the project entirely, tearing a hole in the fabric of the created world as he left, a hole that became the sun. His lesser spirits followed, and their departure created the stars. Those Aedra who remained, diminished and anchored to the world they had made, became the 8 divines worshipped throughout Tamriel. Lorcan's punishment for his perceived deception was the removal of his divine heart, which was cast down to Nirn and buried deep in the earth of what would eventually become Morrowind. That heart did not simply rest, it persisted, and the persistence of Lorcan's heart beneath the earth of Tamriel would thousands of years later become one of the most consequential geological and theological facts in the continent's history. but that consequence would not arrive for a very long time. In the earliest ages, Nirn was still settling into itself, cooling, hardening, learning the difference between sea and stone. Skyrim itself took shape slowly. The Velothi Mountains and the Jarl Mountains rose along its borders through processes that the ancient Nords described not as geological events, but as the actions of gods, specifically the actions of Kine, the goddess of storms, and soon the shield thane of shore. In Nordic theology, the mountains were not simply rock. They were the bones of the world, placed deliberately, and the wind that moved between them was the breath of a divine presence that had never fully departed. The cold that settled over the northern reaches of Nirn was understood as a kind of sacred condition, not hostile, but clarifying. The north was a place where only the strong survived, and the strength required was understood as a form of spiritual worthiness. The earliest inhabitants of Skyrim were not human. Long before the Nords arrived, the land was shaped by forces and peoples whose names survive only in fragments. The most significant of these early presences were the Snow Elves, a branch of Mer culture that had established itself across the northern reaches of Tamriel during the Merethic Era, the age before recorded history. The Snow Elves called themselves the Falmer, and in their earliest incarnation, they were a sophisticated people. They built cities of white stone, developed an understanding of magic that drew on the particular qualities of Arctic light, and maintained a relationship with their landscape that was both reverent and precise. The ruins of their earliest settlements are almost entirely gone now, buried under centuries of ice and Nordic construction, but their presence echoes in the names of certain peaks and in the architectural vocabulary of structures that predate anything the Nords built. The Snow Elves' relationship with the ancient Nords was shaped by one of the most catastrophic events in Skyrim's early history, an event whose consequences branched so far forward in time that they are still being felt in the era of the Dragonborn. The event was the Night of Tears. The city of Sarthal was among the first great settlements the ancient Nords built in Skyrim, and it was destroyed in a single night. The Snow Elves attacked it. The reasons given in most historical accounts are territorial. The Nords had arrived from the continent of Atmora, crossing the frozen sea in numbers that the Snow Elves recognized as an existential threat to their way of life. The attack on Sarthal was, by this reading, a preemptive strike against an encroaching colonizing force. The Nords who survived fled north to Atmora, where they gathered under the leadership of Ysgramor and eventually returned to Skyrim in force. But the Night of Tears concealed something deeper than a territorial dispute. Beneath Sarthal, the ancient Nords had discovered an object of extraordinary power, an artifact so significant that the Snow Elves chose to destroy an entire city rather than allow the Nords to understand what they had found. That object was the Eye of Magnus. Its discovery predated the Nord settlement of Skyrim, buried there perhaps since the earliest days of creation, and its presence beneath the soil of that particular city was not accidental. The Eye of Magnus was a fragment of the god Magnus himself, a piece of the divine architecture that had been left behind when Magnus fled the creation of Nirn. The Snow Elves had known about it. The ancient Nords stumbled upon it without understanding what they held. Ysgramor's return to Skyrim with his 500 companions. The famous 500 companions, the bus of Nordic legend, was the beginning of the end for the Snow Elves as a free people. The war that followed was total and methodical. The Nords drove the Snow Elves from their cities, hunted them through their forests, and pursued them into every corner of the land. The Snow Elves who survived the initial campaigns sought refuge in the underground realm of the Dwemer. The dwarves, the deep folk, the master craftsmen who had built their civilization in the caverns and tunnels beneath Skyrim's surface. The Dwemer agreed to shelter the Snow Elves. The price they demanded was servitude, and with it came something worse. The Dwemer fed the Snow Elves toxic fungi. The blindness that resulted was not accidental, it was engineered. Over generations, deprived of light and dignity and the accumulated knowledge of their own culture, the Snow Elves devolved into the bent, feral creatures that later generations would call the Falmer. The transformation was so complete that by the time anyone outside the Dwemer's underground realm encountered them again, there was almost nothing left to suggest what they had once been. Almost nothing. In the deepest ruins of Dwemer architecture, scholars who looked carefully enough found traces, carved stones that did not match the angular Dwemer aesthetic, arrangements of objects that suggested a different kind of mind had once occupied these spaces. The Snow Elves were still there, underground, in a form so altered it constituted a different kind of existence entirely. The Dwemer themselves were a civilization of such technical and philosophical sophistication that their disappearance remains, in the era of the Dragonborn, one of the most persistently unresolved mysteries in Tamriel's history. They had arrived in Skyrim during the Merethic Era, establishing their great underground cities, Blackreach, Nuchuan-Zel, Mzulft, Alftand, as expressions of a philosophical system that rejected divine authority entirely. The Dwemer did not worship the gods, they studied them. They dissected the principles of divinity with the same methodical precision they applied to mechanical engineering, and the conclusions they reached were radical enough to place them in direct conflict with the mere cultures around them. The Dwemer's relationship with tonal architecture, the manipulation of reality through sound and vibration, gave them access to technologies that appeared to outside observers indistinguishable from magic. Their automata, the dwarven constructs still active in their ruins, were built to function indefinitely without maintenance, powered by systems so sophisticated that no craftsman in the current era has successfully replicated them. The hum of those mechanisms, audible in the deep places of Skyrim even now, carries a quality that is difficult to name, not quite threatening, not quite welcoming, but persistent in a way that suggests the machinery was built to outlast everything around it. In the quiet of those underground halls, the Dwemer pursued a project that would eventually consume them entirely. The heart of Lorcan, that cast down divine remnant buried in Morrowind, had drawn their attention. Their greatest thinker, a figure named Kagrenak, developed tools designed to tap the heart's power and use it to create something unprecedented, a new god, fashioned from the essence of the Dwemer people themselves. The project was called the Numidium, and it was a brass giant of such scale that it functioned less as a machine than as a theological argument given physical form. The Numidium was Kagrenak's answer to a universe governed by divine whim. If the gods were simply power organized by will, then power organized by sufficient will could become a god. The consequences of Kagranak's work did not unfold gradually. They arrived all at once, on a single day, in the year of the First Era, when the Dwemer vanished from Nirn entirely. No bodies were found, no survivors were recorded. Every Dwemer in the world, in every location simultaneously, simply ceased to exist in any form that the physical world could detect. What Kagranak did to the heart of Lorcan in that moment, whether he succeeded in his project, failed catastrophically, or achieved something that transcended both success and failure, remains a question that Tamriel's scholars have never fully resolved. What is certain is that the Dwemer were gone, their cities left exactly as they had been in the moment of disappearance, their machines still running, their doors still sealed, their secrets still buried. The one Dwemer who survived was Yagrum Bagarn, the last known living member of the race, and his survival was a consequence of his location rather than any divine protection. At the moment of the disappearance, Yagrum Bagarn was in an outer realm, beyond the reach of whatever force consumed his people. When he returned to find himself alone, the isolation settled into him like the cold that settles into stone, slowly, completely, without the possibility of warmth. While the Dwemer built their underground empire, the surface of Skyrim was being shaped by a different kind of power entirely. The dragons had always been there, creatures of such age and such fundamental connection to the fabric of creation that they predated most of the gods' direct involvement in mortal affairs. In Nordic theology, the dragons were not merely animals or monsters. They were expressions of the Thuum, the voice, the language of creation itself, the speech through which the world had been spoken into existence. A dragon speaking was not a dragon communicating. A dragon speaking was a dragon shaping reality through the direct application of divine grammar. Alduin was the first dragon, or more precisely, Alduin was the dragon designated by Akatosh, the god of time and chief of the divines, to serve as the world eater, the force that would one day unmake creation so that it could be remade. Alduin's role was not a punishment or a curse. It was a cosmic function, assigned with the same matter-of-fact deliberateness with which a craftsman assigns a tool its purpose. Alduin would devour the world at the end of time. This was not in question. What became a question, the question that drives the entire narrative of the Dragonborn, was when that end would come and whether it could be interrupted. Alduin's relationship with the other dragons was that of a master to subordinates. Under his dominion, the dragons served as rulers over the early human populations of Skyrim. Mortals built temples to them. Mortals brought them tribute. The word walls scattered across Skyrim's landscape were built during this era, great carved stones inscribed with the words of power that the dragons used, preserved so that the knowledge would not die with any single speaker. The relationship between dragons and mortals in this period was not purely adversarial. Some dragons were cruel, some were indifferent. A very few were genuinely invested in the mortals they governed. But the structural condition of that relationship was one of absolute hierarchy, and hierarchies built on absolute power accumulate resentments across generations. The first dragonborn was Miraak. He arose during the Dragon Age. the era of dragon dominion, as a dragon priest, one of the mortals elevated to serve as intermediaries between the dragon rulers and the human population. Dragon priests occupied a position of tremendous authority and corresponding spiritual cost. The masks they wore, carved from materials that varied by rank and region, were not merely ceremonial. They were anchoring artifacts, binding the wearer's soul to a state of semi-divine preservation that allowed them to persist far beyond ordinary mortal lifespans. The masks are still in Skyrim's ruins, and the dragon priests who wore them are still inside those ruins, preserved in a state of undeath that the masks maintain without effort or intention. Mirac's relationship with the dragons he served began to fracture when he encountered Hermaeus Mora, the Daedric prince of knowledge, fate, and the forbidden. Hermaeus Mora offered Mirac something the dragons could not: understanding. Not power in the crude sense, but the specific, terrible power that comes from knowing things that other beings do not know. Mirac accepted the offer. In doing so, he became the first mortal to turn the Thu'um against the dragons themselves, the first to use the voice, not in service of dragon rule, but in defiance of it. The dragons, recognizing the threat, drove Mirac from Nirn entirely. He retreated to Apocrypha, Hermaeus Mora's realm of infinite knowledge, where he remained suspended in a state of preserved power for thousands of years, waiting. The revolt that Mirac had initiated, and then abandoned by fleeing to Apocrypha, eventually found its culmination in the rebellion led by three ancient Nords, Gormleth Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old. These three warriors discovered, with help from the dragon Paarthurnax, that the Thu'um could be learned by mortals as well as dragons. The Greybeards, the order of monks who would later inhabit the monastery of High Hrothgar on the slopes of the Throat of the World, were established during this period as the keepers of that knowledge. But the three heroes who led the rebellion against Alduin required something more than shouting. They required a weapon capable of removing a god from the physical plane without destroying him, because Alduin, as a divine function, could not simply be killed. The Dragonrend shout was created by these three mortals, and its creation was itself an act of profound philosophical violence. The shout embedded in its syllables the concept of mortality, the experience of finite existence, of time with an end, and forced that concept onto Alduin, who had never experienced such a thing. The effect was not physical damage. It was existential disorientation. Alduin, struck by the Dragonrend shout, became briefly comprehensible to himself as a finite being, and in that moment of comprehension, he became vulnerable. The ancient Nords did not destroy Alduin. They used an Elder Scroll, one of those artifacts of absolute temporal authority, whose origins are so distant they predate the concept of origins, to cast Alduin forward through time, removing him from the present moment without resolving the question of his existence. It was not a solution. It was a postponement, and the postponement was always going to end. In the quiet aftermath of Alduin's removal, Skyrim settled into the long Middle Age of its history. The Dragon Age gave way to the Merethic and then the First Era, and the Nords built their civilization across the land with the particular intensity of people who had survived something that should have destroyed them. The ancient Nords were not gentle architects. Their burial mounds, The great barrows that dot Skyrim's landscape were constructed with an understanding of death that treated the afterlife as a continuation of earthly hierarchy rather than a departure from it. The Draugr, those preserved warriors still moving through the dark of the barrows, were not accidents of necromancy. They were the intended result of burial rites designed to keep the most powerful warriors in a state of permanent readiness, guarding the tombs of their lords and the word walls inscribed with power that their culture had spent generations accumulating. The First Era brought the formation of the Elesian Empire to the south, and with it, a new theological order that would reshape Tamriel's religious landscape for centuries. The Elesian doctrines, developed by the monk Maruk under divine inspiration of disputed authenticity, reinterpreted the nature of the divines in ways that systematically erased the Elven contributions to Tamrielic theology and elevated a human-centric cosmology in their place. Skyrim's Nords, already inclined toward their own distinct religious tradition, centered on the Nordic pantheon rather than the Imperial divines, maintained a complicated relationship with Elesian influence, accepting some elements, rejecting others, and preserving in their own practices a layer of pre-imperial belief that persisted quietly beneath whatever official theology the current empire promoted. The mystery of Isgrimor's tomb, located in Ingle Barrow near Windhelm, contains within it a question that the game's lore never fully resolves. Ingle, Isgrimor's son, died during the crossing from Atmara, drowned, the official account states, in a storm that struck the fleet before it reached Skyrim's shores. But the barrow that bears his name contains creatures, the Ingle Shade, and the sea creatures called Hagraven adjacent horrors in the deepest chamber that suggest the death was not simply a drowning. The nature of what guards Ingle's remains and the specific character of the enchantments placed on that location point towards something that happened in the water that the surviving accounts chose not to record. The Second Era arrived with the collapse of the Roman Empire and the long interregnum that followed, a period of political fragmentation during which Skyrim, like most of Tamriel, existed in a state of competing claims and unstable alliances. The Akaviri potentates governed Tamriel briefly during this period, their influence leaving traces in the architecture and administrative traditions of several provinces. In Skyrim, the interregnum period is associated with the proliferation of bandit kingdoms and the gradual degradation of the road networks that had maintained communication between the hold capitals during the Imperial period. It was also during this period that the Companions, the warrior organization based in Whiterun, underwent the transformation that the game never fully explains in its main questline. The Companions' origin stretches back to Isgrimor's 500, and the organization maintained an unbroken tradition of warrior excellence across thousands of years. But at some point in the Second Era, a splinter faction within the Companions made contact with a group of Daedric-adjacent entities called the Glenmoral Witches, and through that contact, the Circle, the Companions' inner leadership, became werewolves. The specific circumstances of that negotiation, the identities of the individuals involved, and the precise nature of the agreement reached with the Glenmoral Witches are details that the game buries in fragments of dialogue and journal entries rather than presenting directly. What the lore makes clear is that the transformation was accepted deliberately for reasons that seemed strategically sound at the time, and that the acceptance created a secret that the companions would carry for generations. A secret with costs that accumulated the way all secrets accumulate, through the slow pressure of concealment. The Third Era opened with the reunification of Tamriel under Tiber Septim, and Tiber Septim's relationship with Skyrim is one of the more densely layered mysteries in the game's lore. Tiber Septim was a Nord. He was born in Skyrim, or in Atmora, or in High Rock. The sources disagree, and the disagreement is not accidental. The uncertainty around Tiber Septim's origins reflects a broader pattern in his life, the deliberate construction of a mythology around a historical figure whose actual biography was considered strategically inconvenient. What the lore does establish clearly is that Tiber Septim was Dragonborn, the first Dragonborn emperor, and that his conquest of Tamriel was achieved not through military force alone, but through the application of the Thu'um in ways that conventional armies could not counter. The Numidium returned during Tiber Septim's campaigns. The brass god that Kagrenak had designed to embody Dwemer philosophical defiance was, in Tiber Septim's hands, repurposed as a weapon of political unification. The Mantella, a soul gem containing the heart of a man named Zurin Arctus, or possibly Wolfhearth, or possibly both. The sources fracture here in ways that suggest deliberate obfuscation powered the Numidium during Tiber Septim's final campaigns. The Numidium's activation produced a temporal anomaly called the Warp in the West, an event so disruptive to the normal flow of cause and effect that the histories of multiple regions of High Rock exist in mutually contradictory states simultaneously, all of them equally valid, all of them equally impossible. The Numidium was never fully destroyed. It was deactivated, disassembled, its components scattered and hidden. But the components persisted, and the question of what would happen if they were reassembled persisted alongside them, a quiet and patient danger waiting in the margins of official history. Tiber Septim's apotheosis, his transformation into the divine Talos after his death, created a theological fracture that would not fully rupture until the Fourth Era. The Aldmeri Dominion, the coalition of Altmer and Bosmer nations that emerged as Tamriel's dominant political power in the late Third and early Fourth Eras, rejected the divinity of Talos on philosophical grounds that were also deeply political. The Altmer, the High Elves, maintained a theological tradition that traced their heritage directly to the Aedra, who had sacrificed themselves to create Nirn, and the elevation of a human to divine status within that framework was not merely offensive. It was, from the Altmeri perspective, a category error of cosmic proportions, an assertion that the boundary between mortal and divine was permeable in ways that their entire civilization was organized to deny. The White Gold Concordat, signed at the end of the Great War between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, banned the worship of Talos throughout Imperial territory. In Skyrim, where Talos was not merely a divine, but a cultural ancestor, a Nord-made god, the Concordat was received as something closer to a desecration than a political compromise. The Stormcloak Rebellion, that forms the backdrop of the game's Civil War questline, drew much of its emotional force from this prohibition. Ulfric Stormcloak's stated cause was the freedom to worship Talos. His actual motivations were more complicated, more personal, and in some respects more troubling. But the Talos question gave the rebellion a spiritual dimension that made it legible to ordinary Nords in a way that purely political grievances might not have. The mystery of Ulfric Stormcloak himself is worth dwelling on. Ulfric studied at High Hrothgar under the Greybeards, learning the Thu'um in the traditional manner. He left before completing his training, a fact the Greybeards note with something that, in their measured speech, functions as disapproval. During the Great War, Ulfric was captured by the Aldmeri Dominion and tortured for information. The Thalmor, the Aldmeri intelligence apparatus, records, accessible in the game through the quest line that takes the player to the Thalmor embassy, indicate that Ulfric may have provided information under torture that cost Imperial lives. The Thalmor's subsequent decision not to eliminate Ulfric, but to allow him to continue his rebellion, suggests that the Dominion considered a divided Skyrim more strategically useful than a unified one. Ulfric may have known this. He may not have. The game does not resolve it. The assassination of High King Torrig, which Ulfric committed using the Thu'um, a shout that struck Torrig down in his own court, is another point of genuine ambiguity. Ulfric's supporters describe it as a traditional Nordic challenge, a duel conducted according to ancient custom. His opponents describe it as murder, using a weapon Torrig had no means to counter. Both descriptions are accurate. The event is not mysterious in the factual sense. It happened, and the accounts agree on what happened, but it is mysterious in the moral sense, and the game's refusal to adjudicate between the two interpretations is one of its more sophisticated narrative choices. High Hrothgar itself carries mysteries that the Greybeards do not address directly. The monastery sits at 7,000 steps above the base of the throat of the world, and the path to it is marked by inscribed tablets that function simultaneously as a devotional exercise and a historical record. The Greybeards who inhabit High Hrothgar, Arngir, Bori, Einarth, and Wulfgar, are men of such advanced age and such accumulated power that their ordinary speech has become dangerous. A Greybird whispering a greeting causes the air to vibrate. When they speak at full voice, the mountain shakes. This is not metaphor. The Thu'um, accumulated over a lifetime of study and practice, does not remain contained within the speaker. It radiates. The fifth Greybeard, Paarthurnax, is a dragon. He is also the most significant figure in the resolution of the Alduin questline, and his position at the summit of the throat of the world, the highest point in Tamriel, is both a geographic fact and a symbolic one. Paarthurnax was Alduin's lieutenant during the Dragon Age. He participated in the domination of mortals. He taught the ancient Nords the Thu'um that they used to resist the dragons, and the question of whether this constitutes sufficient penance for what he did before is one the game explicitly refuses to answer. The Blades, the organization of dragon hunters and Imperial bodyguards, with a history stretching back through the Akaviri, demand Paarthurnax's death. The Greybeards consider this demand monstrous. The player must choose, and the game provides no right answer. The throat of the world's summit holds another mystery in the form of the notched pickaxe, a unique mining tool found at the very peak of the mountain